On Tuesday, US President Donald Trump announced via Truth Social that the US would be imposing an oil embargo on Venezuela, deploying its navy off the Venezuelan coast to prevent sanctioned oil tankers from exporting Venezuelan crude. Trump was cheered on by hawks in Washington, who argued that an embargo would heap yet more pressure on Maduro, given his regime's near total reliance on oil revenues. Although we should note it'll probably exacerbate Venezuela's appalling economic crisis, and the regional migration crisis emanating from the country. Within that Truth Social post, however, Trump also seemed to claim that Venezuela had, in some sense, stolen America's oil and land. Unsurprisingly, this sparked some speculation that the real motive, or at least one of the motives, behind Trump's pressure campaign against Venezuela might be getting America's hands on Venezuela's enormous and relatively untapped oil supplies. This isn't actually the first time Trump has made this sort of suggestion. In 2023, at a rally in South Carolina, Trump said that, quote, "When I left, Venezuela was ready to collapse. We would have taken over. We would have kept all that oil." And in 2020, John Bolton, Trump's national security advisor between 2018 and 2019, claimed Trump told him that Venezuela was, quote, "really part of the United States." So, in this video, we're going to explain why at least some people think Trump's campaign in Venezuela is really about oil, and how this all speaks to a long-standing contradiction in what we might call Trump's oil policy. If you love staying informed and want some of the best reporting on YouTube, then subscribe and ring the bell for more. So to understand why people think this is all really about oil, you need a bit of context. In short, Venezuela has a lot of oil. In fact, according to data from the US Energy Information Administration, or EIA, Venezuela has quite literally the world's largest oil reserves, with something like 300 billion barrels worth of proven reserves, about 40 billion barrels more than second-place Saudi Arabia, and more than triple that of Russia. However, Venezuela isn't anywhere near as big a player in global oil markets as you might thus expect. According to the EIA, for instance, Venezuela is currently producing something like 1 million barrels of oil a day, roughly a tenth of the three big oil producers, the US, Saudi Arabia and Russia, who are all producing more than 10 million barrels a day. This makes Venezuela only the 18th biggest oil producer in the world, in between 17th placed Libya and 19th placed Angola, who both have only a fraction of the reserves that Venezuela does. Similarly, according to CEIC data, Venezuela only exports about 650,000 barrels a day, compared to about 6 million barrels a day for Saudi Arabia and about 4.5 million barrels a day for Russia. You get the idea. Despite its massive reserves, Venezuela isn't actually a big player in oil markets at the moment. So, what explains this apparent underperformance? Well, we see at least three reasons. First, Venezuelan oil is generally pretty heavy. For context, when oil is pumped out the ground, it's an unhelpful mix of different hydrocarbons that can't really be immediately used for anything, hence why it's called crude oil, which thus needs to be separated into usable petroleum products, like gasoline and diesel. However, not all crude oil is created equal. Crude oils have different viscosities or gravities. Heavy crude oil is more viscous, while light crude oil is thinner. Importantly, heavy crude is more difficult to separate and process into usable petroleum products, especially high-value products like gasoline and jet fuel. Unfortunately for Maduro and co., Venezuelan crude is some of the heaviest in the world, making it more difficult and expensive to refine. Second, Venezuela's oil industry has suffered from chronic mismanagement. Venezuelan politicians and officials have long treated Venezuela's state-owned oil company, PDVSA, as a sort of corrupt piggy bank, extracting money from the company that should really either have been spent on improving Venezuela's public services or reinvested back into Venezuela's decrepit oil infrastructure. Third, sanctions haven't helped. Since really 2019, PDVSA has been under a strict US-led sanction regime that has made it difficult for the company to tap international capital markets or export oil. Sanctions have obviously had a direct impact on Venezuelan exports, but they've also reduced PDVSA's oil production because the company can't really attract international capital to fund the necessary investments in Venezuela's oil industry. Trump might be thinking that if the US essentially took over Venezuela's oil industry, whether by replacing Maduro with a more pliant government, or, as Trump implied on Truth Social, literally claiming Venezuela's oil for the US, all these problems could be easily solved. The US could remove sanctions and provide capital for the much-needed investments in Venezuela's oil infrastructure. The US could also help with refining Venezuela's inconveniently heavy crude. Many of America's oil refineries, especially those on the Gulf Coast, are actually designed to process heavy crude from countries like Mexico and Venezuela. This is why the so-called shale boom in the US hasn't made the US energy independent, as both Obama and Trump claimed it would. Most of the oil produced in the US is produced via fracking, and is generally pretty light. Frustratingly for America, its refineries were set up to process heavier crudes from Western Hemisphere producers like Canada, Mexico and Venezuela, which means that a lot of American oil is actually exported to be refined elsewhere, and the US still imports heavier crude from abroad to be refined and then consumed in the US. Revitalising Venezuela's oil industry would thus be good business for not just US supermajors like Chevron, which have outstanding operations in Venezuela, but also American refiners. It would also probably bring down gas prices, because more Venezuelan production means more oil supply and thus, all else being equal, lower oil prices. This would be great news for Trump domestically, given that lower prices at the pump would help tamp down inflation, which has become a real political vulnerability for him lately. However, we should say that lower prices probably wouldn't be good for American producers. Global oil prices are already pretty low by historical standards. Until Trump announced his oil embargo, Brent crude futures were actually trading below $60 a barrel, the lowest they've been since the pandemic. Unfortunately, US producers need relatively high prices to turn a profit. Estimates vary, but most analysts generally think prices have been at about $60 a barrel for American shale producers to just break even, and there have already been a slew of reports suggesting US producers are tightening their belts, with the Energy Information Administration now predicting a drop in American output next year. This speaks to long-standing tension in Trump's oil policy. Higher prices are good for America's domestic oil industry, which Trump's a big fan of, but unpopular with his voters, who really don't like inflation. Now, as a viewer of TLDR News, we know that you're a details person. So you probably check at least a half dozen reviews by forming an opinion, or making a big ticket purchase. You'd read the nutritional information on cereal boxes. You even read the terms and conditions for some app you almost downloaded. So, when you're giving to charity, why should this be any different? Well, today's sponsor GiveWell provides you with those details as an independent resource for rigorous, transparent research about great giving opportunities. For example, their recent analysis of the effect of cash transfers in poor regions of Africa contains over 300 footnotes, which might satisfy even the most meticulous readers. That's because GiveWell has spent 18 years researching global health and poverty alleviation, and only directs funding to the highest impact opportunities they've found. These are things like preventative medication for malaria. It costs about $7 to provide a child with malaria treatment through the high malaria season. These treatments can reduce the number of malaria infections and, with enough treatments, also save a life in expectation. Over 150,000 donors have already trusted GiveWell to direct more than $2.5 billion. Rigorous evidence suggests that these donations will save over 300,000 lives and improve the lives of millions more. You can find all of their research and recommendations on their site for free. And thanks to the donors who chose to sponsor their research, GiveWell doesn't take a cut from your tax-deductible donation to their recommended funds. And if this is your first gift through GiveWell, you can even have your donation matched up to $100 before the end of the year, as long as matching funds last. To do so, go to givewell.org and pick YouTube and enter TLDR News at checkout so they know you heard about GiveWell from us. Again, that's givewell.org to donate or find out more.